Isolation and quarantine overview. Having to isolate or quarantine is not an ideal situation. We understand that this process can be scary for students and families. Here, we are going to give an overview of these processes and answer some commonly asked questions. What is the difference between isolation and quarantine housing? Isolation housing is for students who have tested positive for COVID-19 or have a medical diagnosis of COVID-19. When this happens, students are moved from their current space to an isolation space. Quarantine housing is for students who have been exposed to someone who has been diagnosed with COVID-19 or who has COVID-19 symptoms and is awaiting test results. These students will need to quarantine in their current space for up to 14 days. Some may be released sooner if their symptomatic contact tested negative. In some instances, students will need to move to another space to quarantine. If that is the case, a VCU Residential Life and Housing staff member will let the student know. It is always an option for a student who needs to isolate or quarantine to leave and do so at another location. However, we encourage students to think through their decision and make sure they will be able to receive all the essential items they'll need while maintaining proper isolation and quarantine protocols. How does a student know they need to isolate or quarantine? When VCU Student Health identifies an on-campus resident who needs to either isolate or quarantine, they will notify VCU Residential Life and Housing Isolation and Quarantine Team. A team member will then email the student with instructions and call them and walk them through the process. During this phone call, the Isolation and Quarantine team member will explain transportation if needed, student expectation, meal delivery, garbage collection, laundry services, mental health resources, and student resources. The team member will also ask about dietary restrictions, medical needs, and if the student needs any academic help. One of the roles of the Isolation and Quarantine team is to support students through this process. Students should use the contact number given to them in their initial email to contact the team with any questions, concerns, or needs. What are residents given at the start of isolation and quarantine? Residents in isolation and quarantine who need linens will be given linens along with 3 kits, a health kit, a DSA care kit, and a meal kit. The health kit contains items to help students with their physical health and includes sanitizer, toiletries, surgical masks, and other essential health items. The DSA care kit is designed to support students' mental health and contains tea, art supplies, notebooks for journaling, meditation prompts, notes of affirmation, a postcard with a QR code directing students to resources such as support groups, guided meditations, virtual group exercise, and a Keep on Being Well 2.0 guide. The meal kit includes clear liquids, soups, and snacks. In addition to the meal kits, dining services will also be providing fresh meals delivered daily to residents. If a resident needs a refill on any item or has a concern, they should use the contact number given to them in their initial email to contact the Isolation and Quarantine team. Does anyone check on students during isolation and quarantine? Yes. During isolation or quarantine, staff members will check in with students every few days through a phone call or Zoom. During these check-ins, staff members will ask students if they need any refills on anything, if they need any academic assistance, or if they want to contact counseling services. In between check-ins, students can always call the contact number given to them in their initial email with questions, concerns, or needs. How are students released from isolation or quarantine housing? Students in isolation housing will need to be cleared by VCU Student Health Services before they'll be released. When this occurs, the Isolation and Quarantine team will reach out to the student and give them departure instructions. Students in quarantine will need to stay in their space for the allotted time as determined by VCU Student Health. On the last day of their quarantine, students will be contacted by the Isolation and Quarantine team with departure instructions. More information. For more information on isolation or quarantine housing, please visit housing.vcu.edu/together/isolation_quarantine.